All right. Texans drop a tough one to the Chiefs in a stadium that felt like we were at Arrowhead. If I didn't know any better, if you dropped me into that stadium, I would have said, "Wow, I thought the Chiefs would have sold out a home game instead of just being 80% of the stands." But it was a really good effort by an inferior team in the Texans versus a superior team that is very much in the mix for the Super Bowl. I don't want to give too much credit to anybody here, but there were some really good things that happened in the game. Notably, guys like Tremon Smith and Des King, some of the guys on the Texans defense that have been tone setters. And, Des King, he's played hard and physical all year long. I think he came up big in some particular moments here. Jalen Petrie, who's of those three guys I just mentioned, is the most likely to be here in a few years. Those guys played their asses off. They were they were causing fumbles. And this is big. Tremon Smith and Mario Addison in the fumbles that they caused, it was exactly what defensive coaches wish and strive for. What all you old school football heads complain about these days is, oh man, guys are going for the ball instead of the tackle. They made tackles and caused fumbles at the same time. And that's ultimately what kept the Texans in that game, was the turnovers. And that's where, on the negative side of things, I'm gonna try to tread lightly, because it's not like I want to lambaste Lovie for coaching a team that has serious deficits, and yesterday had 6 more starters out with injuries. They had some serious issues, and they played well. But there's things about Lovie Smith and the way he coaches a football game, the way he manages a football game, that are like hallmarks of what a conservatively minded defensive football coach does. And that's what makes me really nervous with some kind of late season push here where the Texans play competitive games versus good football teams, that some way Lovie works his way back into the equation next year. We don't know for sure if he was on his way to getting fired or not. But I think if you're going to have a young quarterback, whether it's Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, anybody else, I don't want a coach who at the end of, with 4 minutes left in the first half, with a lead of 7 at midfield, the Texans decided to punt and play field position with the Kansas City Chiefs, because your defense has had a little bit of success up to that point, I suppose. That's not the time to tempt the team that averages the most yards per drive in the NFL. So what do the Chiefs do? They end up driving 97 yards and tying the game. And that's like classic, Lovie Smith, defensive-minded head coach. He settled for field goals at times this year where they were the outmatched opponent. You need to be greedy and take those points, take those opportunities when you can. At the end of regulation, when they could have tried for a 16-yard pass that would have given you a 62-yard field goal, which matches Kaimi Fairbairn's career long, and win the game right there at the end of regulation. Instead, they kneel on the ball. These kinds of things are what make me nervous. The other thing, too, is, look, yes, the Texans played hard. That's great. And, yes, Lovie Smith deserves credit for keeping the ship afloat and keeping guys focused, all of that. But I think sometimes it's overstated how hard it is to motivate guys in the NFL at the end of a lost season. I never quite know how to answer this question, because people always ask it, like, hey, Seth, how do you keep guys motivated when you're out of the playoffs or when there's nothing to play for? Guys, look, this is their job. It's like the easiest thing in the world. Motivating a group full of, if they're professionals and they've got good attitudes, guys in the NFL to play hard when they're getting paid. And if they don't play hard, they're going to, A, get their asses physically kicked on television, and B, there's a really good chance they'll get fired. They've seen other guys getting cut here and there with lots of turnover on this team. Like, that's not that hard to motivate. You be a high school coach and try to motivate a team full of kids that just discovered marijuana or something. That's motivation. That's a challenge and a test. So, yes, credit is deserved, but it kind of reminds me that there's a Taylor Tomlinson bit where she talks about how her boyfriend would brag about getting hit on, but he didn't do anything, and he'd want credit for it. And she'd say, "Oh, babe, wow, great. You honored the most basic part of our agreement. Like the very most basic and simple part of our agreement. The primary thing about it is like, oh, okay, we don't cheat on each other. Good for you." So I'll give them a good for you. I'll give genuine praise and credit to the guys that played their asses off and came up and thumped. And some of the guys on offense deserve that too. You're missing your top 2 receivers. Chris Moore only ends up with 40-some yards in that game. But I think it's important to point out that he also drew a couple penalties. And that was a factor yesterday. The penalties definitely favored the Texans. I'm not going to complain or whine about it, but that goes into that mix of, just how plucky were the Texans versus how lucky. I think they forced a lot of errors by the Chiefs, and I don't think the Chiefs were genuinely taking the Texans seriously. And that's how you could see. You saw it in Pat Mahomes' reaction to hard contact, various other Chiefs really like whining and complaining a lot. And if I were a Chiefs fan, I'd be nervous about just what is the constitution of my team. I mean, they looked like the rich kid that had gotten punched in the face for the first time in their lives. And I know that's not fair because the Chiefs have had plenty of adversity and worked through it and played well. That was my impression yesterday, was that they didn't expect the Texans to fight back. And when the Texans fought back, they got a little puffy about it. Travis Kelce, on that 97-yard touchdown drive, Travis Kelce almost screwed it by bulldozing Des King after the play because he just didn't like that Des King, this little dude, was making sure that Travis Kelce was down. So credit for playing hard and effectively, but not too much credit for the playing hard part. That's what you should be doing. That's like the very basic minimum criterion for being in the NFL and thriving in the NFL is to play hard. Yeah, we'd kind of like to believe that we're going to get that. I think that Sean Pendergast had noted that these games are frustrating sometimes when you lose at the end and you can't figure out what to make of it. At least when you're getting destroyed 30-0 by the Dolphins and you have some garbage time production in the second half, you can say, all right, well, that's it. You got to clean house, get rid of everybody. These games were fun to watch these last couple weeks. I'm a little bit more optimistic about it, just in that it's a good reminder to me that on any team, whether it's the Lions from last year, the Jaguars from last year, you're always a lot closer than it feels. And the difference in talent levels is something that my coaches, Coughlin, Capers, Kubiak, all say some version of this. The difference between the top team in the NFL and the bottom team in the NFL is not nearly like the difference in college conferences or other teams like that when it comes to parity and amount of talent on the team. You got to remember, some of those bad teams have high draft picks. A lot of times the bad teams draft bad draft picks, but there's just a lot of physical talent out there. So you're never as far away as you think, and you can see the way the Lions and the Jaguars, where they are with their records, but you see the way with the Texans, with the Chiefs and the Cowboys, that it's not always just so drastic that it's an automatic drubbing no matter what. I think that Lovie has not bought himself a reprieve, I don't think. You got to remember, he was kind of an emergency hire. This was something that happened as the Texans were being added to the Brian Flores lawsuit. I think people in the building were starting to recognize that this fixation with Josh McCown is kind of weird, and that, oh yeah, by the way, everybody else has a coach and the Texans haven't hired a coach yet. And somehow Lovie Smith found his way into the mix after the Texans had already announced that they had a couple of finalists. More finalists were added late in the process, Lovie Smith being one of them. So I think the plan was all along that, hey, if it works out, it works out. And I think that was probably what the plan was with Josh McCown too. If it works out, it works out. But this is a reset, and we're not going to call it a tank or treat it like a tank, but it's at the very least a hard reset. The salary cap clears up a whole bunch in the next couple years. And this is something I don't think I have probably said enough. The Texans' coaching position is actually, on the surface of it, a pretty desirable one right now. And I know that comes as a shock to the most pessimistic and cynical or just depressed amongst us. I am in those categories at various times. On paper, look at the draft picks that they have in the coming years. And it depends on what people think of the upside of Kenyon Green and Derek Stingley. We'll get more to them later. But I think that this is a good situation in terms of draft picks, cap space, an owner in Cal McNair who is very much willing to spend. I know the knock on Bob McNair was that he was kind of fiscally conservative. So far, just based on spending on fringe free agents that are just here for the reset, and improvements in the football operations side of things. A lot of the stuff that Jack Easterby was doing, even though I criticized Jack Easterby a lot of that stuff actually was really good on some of these sub-programs that they do with the player development, nutrition, all that stuff. They spent a lot of money on that stuff. So Cal is very much willing to spend. So that's where I think Lovie being an ad hoc hire gets supplanted by whichever candidates that are out there that might really have their interest piqued by the Texans now, where they didn't when, yeah, Deshaun Watson wants a trade. You've got all these other issues circling the last couple of years. Remember, Lovie was hired when Deshaun Watson was still on the team. Deshaun Watson was your second or third string quarterback at that point. That's how weird a situation it was. Driskel. Okay, the Driskel cat. A radio host in Houston once said that Jeff Driskel needs to get 20 carries in the game against the Chiefs for them to have a chance to win the game. That radio host was I, and man, was I wrong on that. Wow. At halftime, packages featuring the Driskel cat, according to Brooks Cabina, had gained 9 yards on 8 carries. So I think there's one difference between me and Pep Hamilton. I abandoned my theory very early in that game when it became clear that the Chiefs were just dialed in on Driskel and they were not going to have it or allow it, and they just swallowed him up like they were a Roomba and he was a piece of pet fur or something. It was bad. It was really bad. So unless they were going to unleash the Kraken that is Jeff Driskel's arm and have him start throwing the ball, I don't think there was a whole lot of reason to start inserting him into the game for the rest of the game in short yardage and goal line situations. So that's unfortunate, but I think this is Mills' team for the duration. And Mills, who at the half had gotten 6.9 yards per play, which is good, compared to Driskel's 9 yards on 8 plays. They put Driskel in on the third down that preceded the punt from the 50 with 4 minutes remaining. That was when I think it became pretty clear that in any given game, you got to look at the game flow and see what's working and recognize that Driskel wasn't the guy. I think if it comes to Caserio and where I would criticize Caserio after this game, I'm just going to go on the list of people who deserve criticism and or praise. This draft class has been two-faced. I think there's been some good. I think Christian Harris, Dameon Pierce, obviously. Tegan Cotoriano not just had a touchdown reception, but had just a really nice little piece of route running, some head fakery, a jab step, and just a great route run to get that touchdown. I think he is the real deal when it comes to being potentially an all-purpose tight end. They can play, they can block, they can be in line, maybe you split him out a little bit. He's a receiver. That's very, very promising. And yet, the guys at the top of the draft, and Jalen Petrie. Jalen Petrie has very much come along and done some very good things in these last few games. At the top of the draft, Kenyon Green and Derek Stingley have been big disappointments this season. Derek Stingley and Kenyon Green on IR. And I think Derek Stingley is the guy that you wonder, all right, what might have been if he had played in a system like the Jets and he had more opportunities to play man coverage, to really put a lot on his shoulders and test him. And the Texans simply didn't do that. So he ends up playing in soft zone a lot, technically allowing a lot of receptions, but there's times in zone coverage where, yeah, it's a reception, but it's for 5 yards, and that's what you're going to get. It's Darrelle Revis, and that coverage isn't going to prevent the reception. But certainly he hasn't been as impressive as Sauce Gardner. The biggest concern with Derek Stingley was that the knock on him coming out of college was that he gets injured a lot, and that those injuries affect his play. Oh, he was great 3 years ago in his rookie year. He was incredible. And then he wasn't so great and wasn't as good the next couple years, and he missed a lot of time due to injuries. This is a stat you need to know. Because he's on IR and he'll miss the rest of the season, in a potential 40 games over the past 3 years, Derek Stingley has played in 19 of those games. And it's with a few games missed in 2020, but then huge swaths of time missed in 2020 and 2021. And remember that when he really genuinely showed that incredible promise as a freshman, it was in 2019. It was a while back. So this is the concern with Derek Stingley. What version of Derek Stingley are we going to get after Sauce Gardner potentially wins Defensive Rookie of the Year this year, going into 2023? Kenyon Green, I think, had been showing promise up until the Raiders game when he got hurt, had to leave the game, came back in, and he really hasn't been the same guy since. So he's out with an ankle now, and I'm hoping that that's what it was. He's had multiple injuries this year, not of the major variety, but he just needs some time to sit and learn those lessons that he learned during the season, reflect on them, and then hopefully get himself physically ready for next year. So right now, with GMs, you always wait a couple years. Brevin Jordan had a nice catch yesterday, but he's been a bit of a disappointment compared to the promise that he showed as a rookie year. On the radio show this morning, we realized that this year's draft is a butterface, which is it's been at the very top, not so pretty so far, but down below, they're working for our approval. It's not bad. It's not bad down below. The Chiefs, I'm going to say this about the Chiefs' defense. That was sloppy. That was sloppy as hell. I don't know how many interference and defensive holding penalties they ended up with, but that was not good. And just like I said with Chris Moore earlier, a lot of the yardage in that game doesn't look as good on the final stats for the Texans, but there was a lot of earned yardage through penalties that the Chiefs can't play that kind of football and win the Super Bowl this year. They got to figure that out. They got to clean some of that up. And this is 2 weeks in a row now where they've almost blown a huge lead to the Broncos. They are in an overtime game with the Houston Texans. The Chiefs have done this before where they look kind of sketchy midway through the season or even later in the season. And then, I mean, that's how it was when they won their Super Bowl. They lost to 3 AFC South opponents in a row midway through that season. But the fact that they were whining and bitching and complaining so much and then had the ball, they coughed up the ball on 2 hard hits. That's something, man. If I'm Andy Reid, I'm addressing that today in meetings. I'm saying something about it, and I'm going to challenge them. That's where you challenge people's manhood. You talk about ways to motivate guys this late in the season when everybody's tired and it's just the energy isn't quite there. Test somebody's toughness, maybe hint that you think they're not that tough, and the right kind of guys respond to that. Mahomes is so frustrating to watch. Mahomes, on a couple of plays in that game, there was the one touchdown in the north end zone that was like conventionally beautiful. He jammed it off to the right, and the receiver caught it going out of bounds. The one that was weirdly most impressive to me, and this is how it is with Mahomes, sometimes his shorter stuff is the most impressive because he just does it in his own particular way. That 2-point conversion that was a shovel pass, shovel passes are inherently dicey, and they make me nervous if it's my team doing them because there's just so much traffic and clutter they're throwing into. I think most quarterbacks in the league would not have thrown the shovel pass on that play, but because Mahomes can kind of twist and actually end up throwing a half overhand shovel pass instead of dishing it forward, ends up being the perfect play. You know, usually with him, you think of the no-look underhand passes and everything. This one was weirdly awesome because it was an overhand pass in a situation which would normally be a shot put or an underhand. It's reflecting on it now that he's not actively playing my team, it's pretty cool to watch and see in person. I highly encourage you to go watch Pat Mahomes in person, like apparently 60,000 Chiefs fans did yesterday. It was like a Missouri State Fair in there. And by that, I also mean that a lot of those people, they look like farm animals. Thank you for coming to our city. As I was leaving NRG Stadium, I saw a burnt-out RV. They were dousing it. Firefighters were dousing it on the 610 West Loop. There was a barbecue pit. There's a barbecue pit in the left lane of 610 South Loop westbound. That was probably a Texans tailgater, although the Chiefs were out in tailgating in droves too, as I'm told by some fans. And for the most part, I like to pick on Missouri and Indiana and Tennessee, but of those 3 states, I think Missouri is the least inbred amongst them. So I'll take it easy on the Missourians and Kansans. Let's see. Oh, Des King, destined to be a guy that we really liked, but on bad teams. Hit me in the replies. Who is a player from one of your favorite teams who is a really, really good player and you loved him, but it was on bad teams, and ultimately he'll be forgotten except to the truest and most hardcore Texans fans or whatever. Could be Astros, could be, those Astros from the 2013s and 14s and so, like Hank Conger. Enough people know Hank Conger because he's played on a few teams, but Conger has a special place in a lot of people's hearts because he was this lovable guy on a team that sucked, but he also was there for implementing some of the institutions that would endure, like the dugout celebrations. Conger, I've argued, needs a statue out front because I feel like he was part of that milieu of things like Club Astros and everything else that came and injected some life into the Astros. Let's see, Chris Moore plucking that ball out of the air on his first catch was very nice. Chris Moore's had a little bit of a moment the last couple weeks. Again, 40-some yards receiving, but more effective in the game than just that. Somebody asked this in the press box, does Davis Mills need to run more? Because he's not unathletic. He's not as athletic as that bogus 40 time that claimed he ran a 4.57 was, but he's not unathletic, and when he scrambled to the left there, he's a big, strong dude that can run pretty fast. And sometimes I think that he's trying so hard to learn how to play quarterback the conventional way, which is right. That's correct. It's a good thing to do. I think there are times where he could just pull it down and go. And unfortunately, one of those times was during overtime when he was past the line of scrimmage, by the way. He was past the line of scrimmage when he lost the fumble that would lose the Texans the game. So he could have tucked that ball away or been more secure with it when it was poked out. That's concerning because he's usually such a by-the-book, by-the-numbers type of guy that I don't need him freelancing like he's DeAndre Hopkins in that situation or anything. But I also wouldn't mind seeing him run a little bit more. Jalen Petrie and Christian Harris, I don't want to let this go unsaid because I think both those guys are playing really well, and I'm very excited about them. The encouraging thing, I think, about maybe where the Texans' defense can be next year is that they also make a lot of mistakes. I think that Christian Harris, Jake Hansen, who's not a drafted rookie this year or anything, but a younger guy, and Jalen Petrie are guys that have stood out to me as guys that make plays, but also there are times when you might not notice, but they're the guys who are the issue on the defense. That's going to get better. So I'm very optimistic about those draft picks from this year that aren't in the first and second round. I'm still cautiously optimistic about the guys at the top, but Petrie and Harris are still at times just out of position. Some of those big runs were actually Jalen Petrie pursuing over the top, getting a little too rambunctious. So he wasn't even there in the picture when you see them running through a wide open hole and there's nobody tackling. Sometimes it's Jalen Petrie that's supposed to be there. Likewise with Christian Harris on his run fits, especially when the defensive line is slanting. He's not always quite there, but he's getting a lot better at it. So I'm not freaking out about those guys at all. Malik Collins. Remember last year when Malik Collins was getting so many late hits on the quarterback? He was getting pressure, but it seemed like every other time he hit the quarterback, he was getting a roughing the passer or a late hit or something like that. He didn't get flagged yesterday at all, and he was just towing the line. And I said during the game, I'm okay with it. That's where the Texans are right now. If these guys want to go out there and just try to be bullies to the Chiefs, then by all means do it. Malik Collins threw Mahomes down the one time, and I think the reason he got away with it was because, as Landry Locker had pointed out to me, we were up in the press box, Mahomes had fumbled the snap, and then he becomes a runner, so he's not afforded the same protections. Malik Collins threw him down. He threw Pacheco down once. Pacheco is all upset about it after he'd already fumbled on hard contact. I don't know why he was whining about it. He was thrown down with great force and ferocity by Malik Collins, who maybe had a hold of his helmet, so it wasn't a face mask technically, and but he's just watching a little bit there. Malik Collins, I can understand him being frustrated because he gets good pressure, but then doesn't necessarily get the sack as often as I'm sure he wants, because that's when you get paid. But I think he's going to be a part of the rotation moving forward here for at least the next couple of years. Troy Harrison, if any of you watch special teams on the one kick return, he had a nice hit. And again, this was with a form tackle. And that would be my one last criticism of Lovie Smith, who I don't want to pile on to too much. There's obvious limitations with this team. But one reason that the Texans have been playing better defense in the past couple weeks, And it's not great defense. They let up 180 yards rushing yesterday. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves on this improved run defense. But one of the reasons the Texans have been playing better defense and more opportunistic defense is that they've played better fundamental football. They've been where they're supposed to be. They're wrapping up on tackles, and they're causing fumbles while wrapping up on tackles. Even when they're missing tackles, I think you see more discipline in guys running to the ball, really mobbing the ball carrier. So that's been really good to see. But the question would be, all right, well, where was that before? Why is it that week 13, 14, and 15 is when you start playing fundamentally sound football? Lovie Smith's defenses used to be defenses that were known for being fundamentally sound, and that's why they could get away with playing the scheme that they played. This is Lovie's second year with the defense. Let's not forget that Lovie was the defensive coordinator last year. So whenever you're last at something, offensively, defensively, whenever you're in the bottom third or bottom quartile, which the Texans are in a lot of categories, you can't blame it on just the talent. There needs to be swapping out of multiple things. So I applaud the effort by... And remember, I applaud the production, really. But I do like that it's done with a sneer. That's a good development. I applaud some of those guys, some of whom will be here next year, some of whom won't. But at least right there, I think there is something to build on moving forward. Hit subscribe if you've been enjoying this content. I'm going to have Drew Hodgson, my old teammate, on tomorrow. We'll break down some film. I'll also do a reaction to some of the press conferences from Houston and around the league. Thanks, everybody.